This video is brought to you in part by Factor. The PlayStation Portable ended up landing in an interesting space for Sony, a handheld immediately slapped with this label of almost as powerful as the PS2 by media and excited players alike that actually came out far closer to the PS3 that it was being developed alongside. This portable PS2 label never really left it, even though as far as I can find, Sony never outright compared the PSP's power to the PS2. The company's eyes were elsewhere. When it was revealed in spring 2003, only 2 weeks after the iTunes Store had released, the PSP was announced as the, quote, Walkman of the 21st century. If you don't know what a Walkman is, ask your parents about it. This meant this thing would have support for movies as your daily driver MP3 player, and it would have the ability to plug into your computer or game system for excess file storage. However, its release date led to a quirky conundrum. The PSP would have to be compatible with both the PS2 and PlayStation 3, the first major example of a handheld console supporting cross-generation connectivity right out of the box, no peripherals needed. Well, besides your trusty USB cable, of course. This connectivity went beyond the PSP's media player ambitions, of course. Over the course of the system's life, the PSP would be directly compatible with at least 35 different PlayStation 2 games, along with technically only 13 PS3 titles. Although that one has 3 additional asterisks that would stretch that number well into the hundreds. Sony referred to this neat feature by a few different names over the years, from the kinda bland System Link to, in my opinion, the far stronger Cross-Talk, and fittingly some games used it in a blander way, simply locking a bonus item out behind buying the exact same game on 2 different systems, while others went above and beyond and completely changed one or both of the connected games. Up to now, there's never been a comprehensive source that highlighted every single PSP game that promised or had compatibility with the PS2 or PS3. This probably still isn't that, although it's definitely close. I've run through too many games to count dozens of old forum threads and magazine articles with even a whiff of a promised crossover feature, and I even dug through emulator error logs to find any games that tried to call or request the PSP's USB connection driver, and I still guarantee you I missed some Japan-only release or something. If you catch one I missed, let me know so I can add it to the list in the description to make this even more comprehensive than I think it's already close to being. These are the PSP games that could talk to your PS2 and PS3. If you were a PSP kid, you probably remember some of the games that let you bounce your saves back and forth between the PS2 version of a game and its surprisingly faithful handheld version. If you were a Game Boy Advance DS kid like me, you probably remember calling it stupid and saying that you like handheld games that aren't trying to be console games, while quietly being jealous that your friends could carry their WWE creator wrestlers to your house without worrying they would lose or break their precious PS2 memory card.
Can I play with it?
SmackDown vs. Raw 2006 is the perfect example of the early PS2 portable crossover. Not only could you transfer your saves and create a wrestlers, legendary wrestler Jake the Snake Roberts returned to wrestling games after an almost decade-long hiatus as a PSP exclusive character, hopefully calling back to the days when he was, for some reason, almost always locked to the Super Nintendo. The way this works with every PSP-to-PS2 connection and most of the PSP-to-PS3 ones is at its core just a simple USB transfer. That said, I have never actually owned a regular PSP, believe it or not, so please enjoy this visual dramatization. You plug your PSP's cable into your console USB slot, connect the PSP to said cable, launch the games in question on both systems, and in each version's menus you'll find something labeled System Link, USB Connect, Connect to PSP/PS2, or something of the sort. Some games may tell you to initiate the process on one version or the other, but if you read the directions, it's easy as cake, or in this case, snake. If you connected SmackDown vs. Raw's PSP and PS2 versions, you would unlock Jake the Snake on console, but this was the only way to do so without a cheat device. There was a fun rumor back then that he was unlockable on console without the PSP version if you completed a year in the game's general manager mode, at which point he would permanently unlock if you saw him and drafted him to your roster, but you would think wrestling fans would know not to get worked by the internet. The other reason the WWE game is the prototypical PSP-to-PS2 System Link is that it only rocked this feature for this single year. Since the PSP launched outside Japan in 2005, there was only so much time where the handheld would be in focus, the hot new thing before the Xbox 360, PS3, and Wii would take the spotlight away and eat into the PS2's whole only dog in town shtick. So a bunch of series would try the idea out only to drop it in subsequent games, probably in part because promoting the 2 last-gen versions as compatible with a bonus feature might annoy the next-gen players who now feel like they're missing out. During this 1 to 2 year Goldilocks period, though, a bunch of games got creative with their unlocks. Crash Tag Team Racing, for example, featured exclusive battle arenas and vehicles tied to the PS2 and PSP versions that you could unlock in the other for the low price of buying the same game 2 times. In addition to the PSP version having 2 exclusive battle arenas replacing the 2 that are usually available on console, it also had 1 exclusive extra cart for Crash, Cortex, Pasadena Opossum, who yes is a real character, Crunch, and Nina, with each cart replacing one of the carts usually available on all the console versions. Connecting the PSP game to PS2 would unlock all of this for both versions, as well as opening the PSP's exclusive multiplayer co-op race mode for the console version. See, the gimmick with Crash Tag Team Racing was that at any point, any racer could press a button and choose to clash into another nearby racer, combining both vehicles into one and turning one of the 2 drivers into a gunner, mounting a character-specific turret. You could then team up for a bit Mario Kart Double Dash style, losing some max speed but gaining a stronger boost, and making any items you pick up stronger, although the player that chooses to exit the clash first gets a speed boost for doing so, leaving the other in the dust, a crucial step for winning on that final turn. The PSP's co-op race mode would drop the racer count from 8 to 4 and keep 2 players permanently clashed. I'm guessing this was a fun workaround during the PSP port's production to manage the console's limitations when the game wasn't yet fully optimized for 8 racers. All of this PSP bonus content, from the carts to the battle arenas to this extra mode, are completely unavailable on the Xbox and GameCube versions. There weren't even cheat codes that could unlock them. Now, if I had a nickel for every time a Naughty Dog mascot ended up in a violent, explosive racing game, I would have 2. Should be 4, but those bitches won't make Uncharted or The Fast of Us. Instead, we'll have to settle for talking about the best Jak game, Jak X Combat Racing. I'm right. This is one of the cooler examples of a PS2 to PSP crossover, in part because it resurfaced over a decade later and was then kind of preserved, but also because it's not just sync up 2 versions of the same game once and get these artificially locked bonuses. See, by connecting 2005's Jak X to 2006's Daxter game on PSP, you would be able to unlock a couple features for each game, depending on the amount of progress you had made in each game's story mode. On the Jak side, you can unlock a number of characters featured in Daxter's PSP midquel as racers. And if you send a 100% complete save file over from Daxter, you'll unlock the Daxter Mobile, an overpowered vehicle with maxed out stats. You can even use the Daxter Mobile in Jak X's Online, when it still existed, or in the final cup of the story mode, a wonderful incentive to do everything in Daxter because that endgame can get tricky. That said, I only ever got that far on 2017's PS4 emulated re-release because of Jak X's infamous endless autosave glitch that would randomly hit and usually corrupt your PS2 save. It happened to me a lot, and it's why I'm not doing a Jak retrospective anytime soon. With the PS4 version of X, you can unlock all the Daxter stuff right away by simply having a Nathan Drake collection save on your system, since Daxter wasn't brought to PS4 until 2024. On the Daxter side of this crosstalk, connecting your PSP to Jak X would give you a cheat that let you put Daxter's little goggles on his face instead of on top of his head. And if you had a 100% complete Jak X file, you would unlock a purple reskin of Daxter's scooter. Not quite an even balance, but still fun, and I guess your options are a bit more limited when Daxter is closer to Jak 2 and 3 style than, a racing game. On the PS4 and PS5 versions of Daxter, these cheats are unlocked by default now, or at least I think they are. I have them, but I also do have a 100% Jak X save on PS4, so actually, now I'm not so sure. I was kidding about the Jak retrospective thing, by the way. It's still not coming out soon, but there's no deeper reason why. I just wanted to see who would jump the gun in the comments. Anyway, Jak X is a really dumb game, and it's very, very fun. Go play it. Daxter, it's alright. We may as well plow through the other racing games quickly, because a number of them rocked PSP-PS2 bonuses during that short span from 2005 to 2006. If you connected ATV Off-Road Fury Pro on the PSP to the PS2's Off-Road Fury 4, you could transfer things like Ghost Race data, custom tracks, you could exchange and upgrade certain vehicles across versions, and both could connect to a shared online community with chat rooms and news updates. That last one doesn't have too much info available and naturally has been shut down, but it's worth mentioning that unlike with Crash Tag Team Racing and the WWE game, these two aren't just the same game, although they are built on the same codebase. The PSP games got different tracks, mini-games, and a few entirely new classes of vehicle that the console series didn't sport, like snowmobiles. They're pretty much different games entirely, even if they control similarly. The PSP game also has 8 throwback tracks from prior Off-Road Fury games, which, when unlocked, could be sent to the PS2 game. The classic Micro Machines series also featured some crossover in 2006's Micro Machines V4. The console and handheld versions each had 10 exclusive tracks, and connecting the two games would unlock these for the other version. This one though is just about the same game otherwise. The PS2 version has a track editor that the PSP likely couldn't handle, and the PSP had ad hoc local multiplayer in place of split screen, the usual. Same goes for maybe the most dated game on this list, Juiced 2 Hot Import Nights, a game that oozes mid-2000s trash TV styled objectification just like Dad used to make. In addition to cross-save support, you could unlock 5 specific cars in the PSP version of We Have Need for Speed Underground at Home via PS2 save transfer, only here, these were cars that you could otherwise unlock yourself by winning their corresponding pink slip races later on in the game. I think if your bonuses were going to be this sort of surface level unlock, the pre-digital version of getting an extra costume for pre-ordering, I would rather them still be unlockable via regular gameplay like this, versus locked to buying the same game a second time. Speaking of, a far better racing game is our last racer for the PS2 part of this list, Outrun 2006 Coast to Coast, which sadly does do the thing where you have to have both versions to unlock a few cars, radio songs, stuff like that. The PSP version does sport a different set of missions compared to the console releases at least. In fact, every version of Outrun 2 is a little bit different and so good, which makes it just about criminal that they've never re-released them on modern systems. In an interesting twist, the Japanese version of Outrun 2006 cuts out the PS2 to PSP connectivity, so that version just has everything unlocked natively. As far as I found, this is the only time that a Japanese version cuts out the system link. Usually, it was the other way around, where Japanese games would have the feature, and then when localized later on, somebody decided to just unlock the cross-save bonuses by way of a cheat code or something. For example, the PS2's Wild Arms 5 had 6 bonus boss fights that only in Japan were unlocked by connecting to a Wild Arms Crossfire save on PSP, and in turn the PSP game also had some bonuses, including special cutscenes of some sort. I say of some sort because when, at the time, new publisher Xseed signed on to localize these two games, continuing their partnership from Wild Arms 4, they felt it would be better to remove this console gating entirely. All this bonus content is just in each version of the game, so I'm not even sure which special cutscenes in XF are supposed to be special. It's like a 60-hour tactics game that sold 50,000 copies. I could throw a dart and say wherever it lands is a PS2 bonus cutscene and nobody would be able to say it's wrong, but we don't do that here because we have honor. It's this scene. Really quick before we continue, I want to take a moment to talk about the sponsor of today's video, Factor. Look, we all know that life can get hectic, and the first thing that goes when you end up swamped is your food routine. Maybe you skip your meal prep and opt for expensive takeout for lunch all week, or you grab those sad TV dinners at the grocery store just to stay on budget. Everybody gets overwhelmed sometimes, and Factor75.com with the code 50TGB is here to help ease that stress. Each week you pick from a selection of over 35 chef-crafted, never-frozen meals that are ready to eat in just a couple minutes, with options that fit your diet. Whether you're keto, vegan, or vegetarian, or if you want some premium options like filet mignon. And since Factor's flexible based on what you need, you can adjust your order size every week, anywhere from 4 to 18 meals. Or if you only need Factor every other week or just need a break, you can pause or reschedule those deliveries anytime. It's been a busy few months behind the scenes here in Boltland, and even before Factor reached out to renew our sponsorship, I was a paying customer this summer. Just having the option to skip a day here or there of worrying about what to make for dinner and where to find the time to make it, it's so worth it when you need it. And I wasn't even getting that sweet 50 TGB discount. Use that code at checkout or click the link below and you'll get 50% off your first Factor box and free shipping. Once again, that's Factor75.com or the link below with the code 50TGB. A big thanks to Factor for their continued support, and now, back to the video. Despite having a different publisher in Europe, the European versions of these two Wild Arms games also kept that content unlocked from the jump, which brings me to a similar regional disparity. Specifically, any non-North American versions of Metal Gear Solid 3 can link with non-North American versions of the PSP's Metal Gear Acid in what's fittingly referred to as MGS3 Link. Again, literally nobody stuck to one name with this gimmick, everybody had their own name for what they were going to call this. You first had to complete Metal Gear Acid to unlock the MGS3 Link option, and when connected, you would be given the option to load a save or start a new game in Snake Eater. Doing so would give you two overpowered gadgets usually reserved for folks who did some excessive completion criteria, the Easy Gun and Stealth Camo. The latter renders you essentially completely invisible to enemies aside from your footstep noise, and was usually unlocked by either beating the entirety of Snake Eater without the clap of your ass cheeks alerting the guards, or finding and shooting all of the game's hidden frog collectible. The former is a silent pistol with infinite ammo that also makes Snake harder to detect, and it renders your footsteps silent. Usually you'd have to have had every type of plant and animal in the game in your inventory at some point during a single playthrough to unlock this, or you can just play on the easiest difficulty. It's not clear why the American version didn't have this MGS3 link feature, but it may well be because Snake Eater released in North America first, a month before Japan, while Acid wasn't localized for 4 more months. Seeing as how MGS3 and Acid both launched on the same day in Japan, the same week as the PSP, there's a chance this was just a connectivity idea that got implemented at the 11th hour. To that end, the connectivity didn't really go both ways, at least as far as this video's topic is concerned. You could interrogate special Metal Gear Acid codes out of 4 specific enemies in MGS3, but there's no connection bonus specifically tied to the USB link. The dialogue lines revealing those Acid passwords are in the North American release of Metal Gear Solid 3 though, so that probably throws cold water on my assumption there. Meanwhile, you'll need some cold water for Metal Gear Acid 2's connectivity with Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence. This one was available no matter what region you had. Acid 2 came bundled with a cardboard 3D goggle peripheral that you would hook into your PSP and, I'm assuming, look into while playing in public. Aside from the entire game being able to run with or without the Solid Eye for a 3D bonus effect, the main use for it was to view the Solid Eye Theater. As you unlocked more cards, because in case you forgot or were unaware, the Acid games are card-based tactics games, you would unlock new, exclusive 3D videos, mostly of women in bikinis. I'm guessing they breathe through their skin too or something, but the Solid Eye also had use by way of MGS3 Subsistence. The pictures you took in-game on PS2 could be sent over to Acid 2 for you to then stare at them in 3D. Although this does work in any regional versions of these games, Acid 2's manual got cut down only in the American release, and they forgot to explain how to actually link the 2 games. Bouncing from one stealth action game to another, in my opinion, the single coolest use of PSP-to-PS2 Cross-Talk is the SOCOM series, which fittingly is the series that coined that term for this purpose. Not that Sony ever used the term again more than once, but hey. This was essentially the only time that 2 games gave you a reason to connect back and forth continually, aside from of course maintaining one game's save progress between versions. That's because nearly every mission in one SOCOM game would have an optional objective that affected the corresponding mission in its console or handheld counterpart, as well as unlocking content for the multiplayer in each game. First, let's go back a bit. If you're not familiar with SOCOM, this was Sony's tactical shooter franchise that burned fast and bright starting on the PS2, with 10 games in 9 years before 2011's SOCOM 4 put a bullet in it for good. It didn't help that that game was released right as the Sony hack took PS3 servers down for months, but by 2011 the series had already started to lose its way and been drowned out by the much faster style of shooter. And also by there being so many shooters that you were guaranteed to get lost in the shuffle. Case in point, SOCOM released in the same year as FPS games like Killzone 3, Homefront, Brink, Patapon 3, Duke Nukem Forever, Resistance 3, Battlefield 3, and Modern Warfare 3, and I left out several. Now that said, there's a reason that SOCOM got so many games that Sony brought on a second studio and split the main studio Zipper Interactive into 2 teams to keep pumping out more shooters. SOCOM was one of the earliest and most successful online PS2 games, with the 2002 original coming bundled with a headset for online voice chat or even for issuing commands to your computer-controlled squad in the offline campaign. There was a time when SOCOM was getting talked about in the same conversation as Halo, to the point that Zipper outright poached one of Halo's multiplayer leads to head up that second internal team. Bungie and Zipper were even located only a few miles away from one another. The console war comparisons wrote themselves. Now that time in the spotlight was brief, since the series, explicitly branded after an American military arm, only really found substantial success outside America in 2002, before quickly falling apart between differing rates of broadband adoption in different countries and the general split in European sentiment towards the US military because of the whole 2003. The series' sales at home also declined anyway as the games went on, because slower-paced tactical squad shooters weren't most players' cup of tea, but that didn't stop them from releasing 4 SOCOM games on PS2 and 4 more on PSP. The combos in question for this USB connectivity are SOCOM 3 and SOCOM Combined Assault on the PlayStation 2, respectively connecting with SOCOM Fireteam Bravo 1 and Fireteam Bravo 2 on the PSP. See, on the PS2 side you controlled Fireteam Alpha, and in Fireteam Bravo, these two sets of games each ran concurrently alongside their partner game, often with Fireteam Bravo executing their Mission A in one area, setting up Fireteam Alpha to start their Mission A shortly thereafter. On each side of this, missions would have an optional objective specific to Cross-Talk that, if completed, would directly impact the other squad's mission. For example, destroying a radio transmitter as part of a particular SOCOM 3 mission meant that Fireteam Bravo had far fewer reinforcements to deal with due to enemy communications being affected. Meanwhile, capturing a specific character in that same Fireteam Bravo 1 mission would provide intel that unlocks mortar support during the SOCOM 3 mission. You could do either in any order and swap data back and forth as often as you would like. Incrementally transferring your progress over helped you no matter what. The same is true for Fireteam Bravo 2 and SOCOM Combined Assault. Completing an optional objective on the PSP might move up the PS2 team's mission time so that you're deploying at night, making it easier to infiltrate an enemy base without being detected. It's such a neat feature that required way more forethought and collaboration than anybody really expected, and it meant that SOCOM fans had every reason to get a PSP and keep up with both subseries. I also want to shout out ClasherX35 on YouTube, who has 4 comprehensive videos, 2.5 hours in total, showcasing each game's Cross-Talk bonus effect for every single mission. As of right now at least, it's the only thing on their channel, so they went above and beyond to document something that even the fan wikis couldn't elucidate well. Again, every other PSP to console connection tends to go one way or the other if the effect is anything more than bringing your game save on the go or unlocking some small bonus item. So for these PSP games to be treated on the same level as the PS2 ones here, I just didn't believe it until I saw it in motion. There are just a few more PS2 to PSP examples of note before we move on to the PlayStation 3, but first let's rapid fire the easy stuff. About a dozen PS2 games let you bounce your saves to and from the handheld version and did nothing else. Mostly sports games like FIFA 07 to 09's Career Mode, Madden 06 to 08, Pro Evolution Soccer 2005 all the way to 2010, NHL 07, and NBA Live 07. Though for that last one, you had to start your Dynasty Mode file on the PS2 specifically. In these other cases, you could start your save file on the PSP first, but only NBA Live was weird about it. Not surprising for a series that once canceled the game after it had already reached stores. Oddly enough, despite the MLB The Show series being made by Sony's San Diego studio, making it a perfect poster child for cross-compatibility, it never sported PSP to PS2 connectivity. A baseball series that did, kinda, is the Japan-exclusive Power Pro series, although many of these games actually just shared data via a password system rather than directly connecting via USB. 2007's World Series of Poker Tournament of Champions also featured cross-save support, in case you wanted that. Only this specific entry in this 3-game series had this feature, not the 2006 or 2008 games that did both come to PS2 and PSP, but I'm only highlighting this game for more than a sentence because they allowed you to play online using your PS2 iToy in case you wanted to play Omegle with the 45-year-old divorced dad smoking and playing PS2 poker shirtless in his den. There's no way, man. I get the idea, reading people's bluffs, but somebody involved in that decision should probably be investigated. Another game worthy of investigation, if you ask series fans, is Super Monkey Ball Adventure, which sported basic cross-save functionality, as did the breakdancing battle game B-Boy, developed by the studio that would later make DJ Hero. And now we close out the PlayStation Portable's PS2 fling with our last few regional quirks. Armored Core Formula Front is a Japan-only PS2 game that did get a worldwide release on PSP. That Japanese version supported cross-saving with the console version, obviously we didn't need that anywhere else. A Japan-only visual novel named Routes also rocked cross-save. I'm guessing if there were any PSP to PS2 System Link games that I have missed, it's probably going to be something up that alley. Yu-Gi-Oh! GX Tag Force 2 on the PSP links up with the beginning of Destiny on PS2, known outside America as Tag Force Evolution, which is an enhanced console port of Tag Force 1. Connecting the two unlocks a championship pack of cards in Tag Force 2, which is obtainable through regular gameplay otherwise, as well as bonus outfits for 5 characters, the same 3 promo bonus cards in both games, and a 10,000 double penetration boost in both games as well. Considering I got 1,630 double penetration from just one battle, I'm gonna say this one wouldn't have been worth the extra $20 to $40 $40 it would cost to buy both games. That one's not really a regional quirk aside from the naming conventions, but Shinobi-Do Way of the Ninja on PS2 is, because this game and its PSP sort of sequel Shinobi-Do Tales of the Ninja on PSP both came out only in Japan and Europe. Developed by Studio Acquire after they were unable to acquire the rights for their Tenchu series, Shinobi-Do is a weird, awkward stealth game that, if it clicks for you, will immediately cement itself as a cult classic. I don't really see it, but I'm fascinated by it nevertheless. Like Tenchu before it, the PS2 game has a full-fledged mission editor that lets you utilize any of the items and NPCs from throughout the story, which you could then save to a memory card or a USB stick to distribute. The game actually did well enough in Japan that publisher Spike released a full PS2 expansion disc there that contained 130 of the best fan-submitted missions as judged by the dev team and gaming magazine editors. If your level was selected, you got featured in the credits, a free copy of the game, and apparently some kind of commemorative trinket. This level creator is also where the PS2 game connects with its PSP counterpart / kind of sequel thing, letting you move your created missions from console to handheld. However, there's a fun, bad wrinkle. The PSP has a different control scheme, owing to having fewer buttons and only one analog stick. No solution was implemented for the fact that on PSP this meant you had fewer item slots, so some of your PS2 missions could be impossible to complete on PSP. Last but not least is the mother of all PSP games, Monster Hunter. If you know early Monster Hunter, you know its release history is a complicated web to explain. For example, Monster Hunter 1 came out on PS2 worldwide, was then upgraded only in Japan and Korea as Monster Hunter G, and Monster Hunter G was then updated again for the PSP, where it became Monster Hunter Freedom, which then released worldwide. Monster Hunter 2, meanwhile, or if you prefer its Japanese name, Monster Hunter DOS, I'm not kidding, that PS2 game didn't leave Japan, with Capcom instead waiting for the following year to release it worldwide on PSP as Monster Hunter Freedom 2, which they then added to and re-released on PSP again as Freedom Unite. That's just the first DOS games, but thankfully DOS is what we're looking at today. The Japan-only PS2 game locked a handful of cosmetics and forge items behind connectivity with Monster Hunter Portable 1. Not 2's PSP port, named Monster Hunter Portable 2nd, but the PSP port of the first game, the one that we know as Monster Hunter Freedom. Connecting Portable 1 to Monster Hunter DOS was also the only way for you to fight Jan Garuga on PS2 in that game. Although this has since been patched by dedicated fans to work via cheat code both on emulator and PS2 hardware, even working with the fan-made English patch for DOS. So that's either every or very close to every example of PSP games that could in some way communicate with your PS2. Surprisingly, at least if you don't know how Sony usually works, it's surprising, not all that many first-party PlayStation games utilized this feature, and the ones that did were all from the North American studios. My favorite one, though, came from Sony Liverpool, and it's not just my favorite because it's the perfect segue to PS3. Announced in May 2006, F1 2006 on PS2 and PSP was slated to release only 2 months later ahead of the next-gen F1 Championship Edition that would grace the PS3's launch window. It's important to repeat that F1 2006 was announced in May and released in July because when it was announced, it was advertised with a PSP first. Both it and the PS2 version would be fully compatible, not necessarily via USB save transfer, but with actual cross-platform online multiplayer. While the full season mode wouldn't be playable online on PSP like it was on PS2, you could connect your handheld to Wi-Fi and lobby up, race against your buddy who was in a different house playing on their PS2, and it would just work. So that was a fucking lie. When F1 2006 launched in July in Europe only, they quietly avoided all mention of the promised online functionality, which not only doesn't allow for the two platforms to kiss, it's not even there on either platform. They pulled the online plans at the absolute last minute despite the prior 2 F1 games, Sony first-party games, having online on PS2. And again, F1 is the perfect segue here because you might remember Sony's legendarily horrendous E3 presentation in 2006. One of the big games there was the aforementioned F1 Championship Edition, and one of the coolest crossover uses for the PSP that we would ever see came during this part of the showcase. They hyped up the ability to connect your PlayStation Portable to your PS3, place it where you want it as long as it was plugged in, I guess, and use it in this game as a dynamic rear view mirror. I don't know why anybody would ever want to do this, but it's a really cool idea that never came out. Shortly after F1 Championship Edition released, Codemasters swiped the exclusive rights to F1 games from here on out, and this 1-2 punch of overhyping and then outright falsely advertising was the last time Sony dealt with this franchise directly. You might be thinking the rear-view mirror thing was related to Gran Turismo instead. It's a common misconception, probably because we all forgot Sony ever even had the exclusive rights to F1 for a decade. But no, Gran Turismo never had this feature planned or announced whatsoever. That's a bit of a Mandela effect. Instead, it featured connectivity between its long delayed PSP title and Gran Turismo 5, allowing you to send your favorite cars from Gran Turismo PSP to a portable garage in 5, where they could then be used in arcade mode. Now, supposedly Gran Turismo PSP was either intended to feature compatibility with Gran Turismo 4, or people just widely assumed that because the PSP game was announced in 2004 as Gran Turismo 4 Mobile. It ended up missing that projected April 2005 release date by only 54 months. This is also the only time I will ever have a good reason to talk about this. For some reason, when they relaunched their press hype cycle for Gran Turismo PSP at Gamescom in 2009, they rented a big-ass crane and hauled a conference room table 50 meters in the air to give journalists a view of Cologne, Germany, while they played Gran Turismo on their PSP Go. From what I've gathered, they maybe also didn't tell the outlets that this was going to happen, so I have to think at least one person afraid of heights was without warning subjected not only to being hoisted onto a gaming chair on a glass floor 150 feet in the air, but also subjected to even worse, the PSP Go. Now, a bunch of the PSP to PS3 System Link games are in the same vein as the PS2 ones, such as Prince of Persia: The Forgotten Sands, granting you a whopping 2 upgrade points and a Sands of Time skin for connecting to the PS3, which was later just made available through Uplay. Or Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, letting you transfer your save file back and forth, except they called it transfer sharing, because Kojima. Interestingly, Peace Walker supports full dual analog controls on the one analog stick PSP as well. That's because the PSP Go included Bluetooth support so that you could sync up a PS3 controller. Madden 2010 on PS3 let you create your own custom plays, which you could then send to your PS3 copy, which I think might have been the only way to create plays in that year's Madden? Create plays. That's conveniently close to the create, play, share tagline rocked by a few PS3 exclusives. Ah shucks, look, a well-placed Mod Nation Racers. So this is a unique one in that it doesn't exist anymore, because connecting the PSP to the PS3 versions was entirely based on logging into a server rather than hooking the PSP and PS3 versions up directly via a USB menu option. ModNation PSP and PS3 didn't really interact otherwise, even their track creation suites were isolated from one another, but connecting both versions online once would give you an airplane cart body, a pilot's hat for your avatar, and a couple other cosmetic things like that. Little Big Planet PSP is another create, play, share example, this time of intended compatibility that never did see the light of day. Even though LBP PSP was always shown off as a distinct entry in the series with its own story mode, not just a port of the first game, throughout production Media Molecule and Sony reps noted several times that they were looking into whether connectivity was feasible, and at one point they even announced it using the same Cross-Talk name that SOCOM had used. By launch though, whatever issues they may have been having working the PS3 game's costumes and whatnot into the PSP version were too much to manage, not to mention the fact that the PS3 levels were never going to be compatible given that the PSP game already had to cut the side-scroller planes of movement from 3 layers of depth to 2. So LBP PSP Cross-Talk never came to pass. Given how much bloat the Little Big Planet games eventually amassed with what's gotta be thousands of costumes, millions of custom levels, not anymore, and the focus on making sure that all of your purchases were compatible across games and eventually consoles, between Media Molecule's Vita Little Big Planet game, the Mod Nation Racers team's LBP karting on PS3 and Vita, and Sumo Digital eventually coming in cold and having to make all of this compatible with Little Big Planet 3 both on PS3 and PS4, which had never dealt with any of the LBP games before. Yeah, I think this is the one that gets a pass for the team expressing lofty hopes that even this game would be able to connect to every facet of Craftworld, only to realize that it just wasn't gonna work. What doesn't get a pass is that the LBP PSP box promotes trophy support when PSP trophies were quietly scrapped from Sony's plans right around this time. The Greatest Hits versions box made sure to remove that after people called Sony out. There is at least one other PSP version of a console game that briefly mentioned Crosstalk that, as far as I could see, just isn't there in the game: Army of Two: The 40th Day. Considering that handheld port was made by a completely different team in a top-down style, I wouldn't at all be surprised if that just fell through the cracks. I mean, hell, I didn't even know until today that there was a PSP version of that game, and I'm betting most EA employees at the time didn't know either. Taking a leap to a portable game that was built with its PS3 cohort in mind, so much so that the two games released on the exact same day, Assassin's Creed Bloodlines on PSP, when connected to AC2, kinda went the SOCOM route with its compatibility, giving Ezio a new weapon in 2 for each boss you had Altair defeat in Bloodlines. You could also just send money from Bloodlines into 2, and based on Ezio finding specific pages from Altair's codex in the console game, you would gain the ability to block with the hidden blade in Bloodlines, get extra health and counter damage, and even get the ability to shoot throwing knives from your hidden blade. I would say this might be the second coolest example of a game utilizing PS3 to PSP crossovers, just because I'm a sucker for the idea of being able to bounce between two games and use the ongoing progress from one to affect the other. In practice, it doesn't really affect Ezio's game all that much. Obviously, having some decent weapons from Bloodlines and extra cash would serve you well if you're in the early chapters of 2, but it is, at the end of the day, just a fun bonus. In Bloodlines, however, that hidden gun can just completely break the game in your favor. That's the kind of bonus we're looking for. Now, I mentioned at the top of the video that there were just over a dozen PS3 games that had some sort of system link with the PSP, and we've already gone over half of them. With the launch of the PS3 came a whole new set of possibilities for how the PSP could interface and work with the mainline PlayStations, especially from 2008 onward as the PSP gained its version of the PlayStation Store. However, the reality was that no matter what they were saying publicly, the PSP's PS3 cross-functionality was merely a testbed for a bunch of ideas that engineers would assume they would be able to iron out over time with future handhelds like the next-gen portable, later known as the PS Vita. I don't have to tell you how that worked out, given that the Vita launched almost 2 years before the console companion meant to be its sibling, leaving it in the same cross-gen limbo as the PSP, and leaving it dead in the water before the PS4 could even come out and try to lend a hand. But you can see in the Vita's cross-buy and cross-play functionality in PS4 Remote Play on Vita, you can see more than a squirt of the PSP's DNA. That's where the technicalities I mentioned at the top of the video start to come into play. Those 3 different asterisks that took the PSP's PS3 crossover from a handful of games to several hundred. Let's hit on those now. First, every PS1 classic that was on the PlayStation Store was cross-compatible between PSP and PS3, obviously, letting you bounce the games and their saves at any time with a simple USB connection. I don't think it really counts, but I've got to mention it, especially since from 2006 to 2008, you had to buy those classics on PS3 and manually transfer them to your handheld since the PSP didn't have a storefront yet. There was even a weird, brief period from December 2006 to April 2007 where the PS3 wasn't yet able to emulate the digital PS1 games itself, so you had to buy your PS1 games on PS3, but you could only play them on PSP. Number 2, this counts even less. Remember PS Minis? That'd be a good video title. Those super bite-sized smartphone-styled games that launched alongside the PSP Go during the early days of the iTunes App Store. Well, a few months after their introduction, Sony made all minis compatible with PS3 and combined the downloads so that buying or downloading a mini on console would seamlessly give you the option to download both versions and then transfer the PSP file later via USB. This meant you could play the Impossible game or Jetpack Joyride or another few hundred minis on either system, although because minis specifically did not allow for DLC, online multiplayer trophy support, and were limited to only 100 megabytes, I don't think that there are any of them that had saves or anything that you could swap from system to system. Still, technically the PSP did have the option of communicating with the PS3 to obtain these games. I don't think it counts either, but that does give me a reason to mention the sadder reality of the PS3 to PSP connection. In 2022, a PSN security update began requiring two-factor authentication for all accounts on all platforms for PlayStation. The short version of what that meant is that the PSP, 3, and Vita's operating systems couldn't authenticate one another simultaneously via USB connection without causing issues, and rather than figure out how to fix that for operating systems that few current employees even worked on, they just let the connection die. Kinda lame if you ask me. You can still download your purchased games, and you can swap PS1 saves between the PSP and PS3 still, but given that the PSP's storefront is actually dead, it means that if you bought a mini or an old PS1 game on PS3 today, good luck getting it onto your PSP legally. But also, why would you have a PSP that isn't jailbroken at any point after like 2007? Come on, that thing was an emulation machine. The third and final of those asterisks is the PSP's limited remote play support, another early tester for a feature that would become far more prolific with future iterations, to the point that the current PSP, the PlayStation Portal, is just a remote play machine. In addition to every PS1 game being remote play compatible from PS3 to PSP, not just digital downloads, but any PS1 disc that you owned at all, in addition to that, another 30 or so PS3 games or apps were specifically designed to have PSP remote play support. Almost none of these 30 are games you would ever want to play with the considerable amount of latency. I don't know who thought BlazBlue would be a good fit, for example, and in some cases, the remote play functionality was only for stuff like browsing your SingStar song list while somebody else is singing so that you could queue up the next song on your karaoke list. My favorite example, though, is the very first remote play game, Lair, a game which, at the time that it became available to remote play on your PSP, wasn't playable on PSP. See, Lair was a game that for a good while required motion controls, which the PSP does not have. That was fine though, they mapped the movement to the PSP's analog stick, which along with the game running even worse thanks to the lag, actually meant that, according to some, the game was paradoxically more responsive. I believe the remote play support actually came before Lair was patched to make all the motion controls optional too, which would mean that there was a brief period of time where this was the only way to play Lair with an analog stick. And even then, you couldn't beat Lair via remote play because you still needed the L2 and R2 buttons to land your dragon. You know what the PSP doesn't have? Outside of playing turn-based PS1 games, or I guess if you really wanted to use your PSP to play a PS1 disc that wasn't digitally released, again, why would you not just have an emulator on there? There just wasn't much utility to remote play at this point. Neither system was really meant to handle it. Once again, you can see why I'm calling these three asterisks. They don't really count to me. They're cool caveats that are worth mentioning in the history of PSP console compatibility, but they're also all examples of features that these systems and the entire PS network infrastructure just weren't designed for, that would be tacked on here as a sort of test run for better integrations down the road. Stuff like the PS3 Vita cross-buy, or every non-VR PS4 game being required to be at least somewhat remote play compatible on Vita, with the back touchpad handling the missing PS4 buttons as best it can, learning lessons from, Lair not having L2 and R2 buttons. That lets us jump back to the PSP to close this out, and before we get to the best example of PS3 to PSP Cross-Talk, we've got a Japan-exclusive lightning round. Of the 7 remaining games that feature PS3 to PSP cross-compatibility, 5 are exclusive to Japan, and 1 came out everywhere but North America. If you were playing the Japanese version of Valkyria Chronicles 2 on PSP, you could connect to a Japanese console version of the first game in order to unlock a specific character. I won't mention the character name for the sake of possible spoilers. In the international release of Valkyria Chronicles 2, this was instead implemented as a cheat code. The portable and console versions of a lengthy Japan-only visual novel called Reminiscence of Haruhi Suzumiya feature save transfer. I don't know anything else about those games, and if you tell me, I don't care. If you thought we were done with Monster Hunter earlier, you would be mistaken, as Monster Hunter Portable 3rd, which in its simplest terms is a PSP overhaul of Monster Hunter Tri for the Wii, not exactly a straight port but a fairly different game, it later got the first PSP to PS3 HD remaster in 2011. On top of letting you take your save file across both versions, these two games supported ad hoc multiplayer between a PSP player and a PS3 player. As far as I'm aware, the only game that lets you play cross-platform online between the two systems. In case you're unfamiliar, multiplayer PSP games had 2 main connection methods, both of which really could have used a gimmicky name. There's ad hoc, which lets you connect directly to other PSPs nearby, even if there's no Wi-Fi network present, and infrastructure, your more traditional multiplayer setup where you're using Wi-Fi connecting to a router or an access point or something, and connecting over the web to other PSPs. While I'm at it, if you're curious, the PSP did have its own version of Nintendo DS Download Play where only one player would need a copy of a game. About 100 PSP games featured what Sony called game sharing for multiplayer, with another 20 games that would give the downloading players a single-player demo of the game being shared. Now, Monster Hunter didn't support download play, but it did get a special themed reskin of the PS3's ad hoc party app, which makes a lot of sense seeing as how that's genuinely almost all people ever use that app for. Ad Hoc Party was a free app on the PlayStation Store that would allow you to wirelessly connect your PSP to a PlayStation 3 as long as the PS3 itself was using a wired Ethernet connection, and use the console as an access point to connect to other players also using Ad Hoc Party. This way you could play games online that usually required you to be right nearby. You could even use the PS3 eye camera or a headset for voice chat over Ad Hoc this way. I guess this would actually spawn a fourth asterisk to the PSP's console crosstalk list now that I think about it, because a few dozen PSP games also worked this way, but all Ad Hoc Party does is connect you to other PSPs using your PS3 as a pass-through. It's not like the PSP is communicating with a PS3 game otherwise here, again, with the exception of Monster Hunter Portable 3rd. The idea of playing co-op Monster Hunter with a buddy, hanging out on the couch and not having to deal with split screen, that sounds rad, aside from the fact that I would have to play Monster Hunter. You can't make me. I've tried again and again, and it just doesn't click. If you're like me, you had never heard of Level 5's White Knight Chronicles series until after playing Ni no Kuni and looking up what else they made because you wanted more. I bought White Knight Chronicles 2 at GameStop for like $5 back then, since, the entire first game was included too. What a deal, right? I played it once. It's a 1 to 4 player RPG, although I guess 1 to 6 player on the second game, that also included a version of Level 5's Georama town building system that appeared in a few different series from the company, most notably Dark Cloud. Georama in this case also acted as an online lobby/hangout system, like a very rudimentary MMO town. Part of the reason 2 came with 1 bundled in is that White Knight Chronicles 2 is not really a 2, it's a straight up expansion. In Japan, you had to have a finished save file from 1 in order to even load up the second game. They did remove this requirement in the localized release, letting you start 2 at level 35. The PlayStation Portable's White Knight Chronicles Origins, however, did not make it to North America, only releasing in Japan, followed by dropping in Europe on the same day as 2, the game with which Origins connects. That means the PSP Link feature is removed from 2 in North America as well, but in the other versions, you could link up 2 with Origins and export each save into the other once you reached a certain point in each game's story. Doing so would add a bunch of unlockable items to 2's in-game adventure store, and I believe the same is true for Origins, although I'm not sure what items are unlocked specifically. Whatever the case, because the PS3 game's servers were taken down years ago, and as far as I could find, there aren't any fan server revivals, Origins is the only White Knight Chronicles game that you can play with friends now. Also, those servers being down have made the 2 PS3 games some of the most time-consuming trophy hunts maybe of all time. Hundreds of hours of grinding the same few missions just to level up. Speaking of a grind that most people would never care to endure, the penultimate PSP crosstalker on this list is also, in my opinion, the most cynical. Hatsune Miku's Project Diva rhythm game series first graced the PSP in 2009, again in Japan only, with a sequel Project Diva 2nd releasing in 2010, and Second's expansion/really just a third game Project Diva Extend in 2011. Each of these games, a year after release, would be ported to PlayStation 3's digital storefront by way of Hatsune Miku Dreamy Theater 1, 2nd, and Extend. You would think these games just let you transfer progress or something, right? Not exactly. See, the Dreamy Theaters are games that you can purchase and download on PS3 that you cannot play unless you also own the corresponding Project Diva game on PSP. These are functionally the exact same games, just graphical upgrades, and in fact a bunch of features like the track editor are actually removed on PS3, but Dreamy Theater on console requires you to connect to the PSP game in order to play the PS3 game. So what you had to do was buy Project Diva on PSP, play it, enjoy it if it's your thing, and then buy and download Dreamy Theater on PS3, while also downloading the corresponding Dreamy Theater Connection app on PSP. Then you would plug your PSP in, launch the PS3 game and the Connection app on PSP, and transfer your progress over. The only songs that you can play on PS3 are the ones that you have unlocked on PSP. You can't make separate progress in the PS3 version, and in fact, for the first Dreamy Theater game, you have to keep your PSP plugged in and on the entire time while you are running the PS3 game. If you disconnect it or turn the game off, it will not let you continue playing on PS3. That requirement, the weirdest always-on requirement I've ever heard in my life, was apparently removed for Second and Extend. You only had to authenticate once, although if you unlocked more songs on PSP, you would then have to reconnect to update what tracks that the PS3 version of the game you bought twice you are allowed to play. Now you might think that this is just a companion app situation, that it cost maybe the equivalent of $5 or whatever. No. Dreamy Theater 1 cost 3,000 yen in 2010, a little over $30 at the time. Dreamy Theater 2nd and Extend each charged 3,900 yen. The PSP games at release were around 6,000 yen, more than your usual PSP titles, so best case scenario, you were a late adopter to one of the games and you bought one of them a year later when they released the Greatest Hits Value Edition to tie it into the PS3 port or to promote the next game. That Value Edition would cost you about $30 digitally, a little more physically, and then you would have to pay at least that much again for the digital PS3 game that, again, you cannot play without the PSP game. That's okay though, Sega was nice enough to let you download any of the DLC songs for free on PS3, as long as you had already paid for them on PSP. Not like they'd want to double charge you, right? I'll say again as we look at the final, and in my opinion coolest PSP game that communicated with a PS3 sibling, that this video is close to, but likely not entirely comprehensive given how little communication that PSP System Link and the attached games ever really got. If you know one I missed, or even if you just think there's one I missed, let me know so I can look into it and add it to the hopefully then 100% comprehensive list that'll be in the description. And hell, share the video around to friends and communities who would enjoy this kind of stuff and might be able to help us add even more insight. There's usually no better series than an Insomniac series at taking full advantage of and highlighting all of a system's features and bright spots. Resistance might not show it quite as well today, but that first game's glass-shattering physics, for example, it still puts a ton of modern games to shame. So, of course, it only makes sense for Bend Studios' PSP spin-off Resistance Retribution to go way further with compatibility than anybody expected the PSP to. The game itself is fine. It's a fun third-person shooter with good amounts of aim assist to account for the whole one analog stick thing. Where Retribution shines is in its two different forms of PS3 connectivity. By connecting your PSP to your PS3, loading up both Retribution and Resistance 2, and selecting the Infect PSP option within 2's menus, you would pretty substantially change the story of Retribution as well as its gameplay. This infected mode rewrites the campaign so that our soldier protagonist James Grayson is recruited by a character also referenced within Resistance 2's story. The missions, their order, the general game flow, none of that changes much, but because in this alternate story Grayson is injected with the Chimera virus just like the console series Nathan Hale is in Resistance 2, he looks and acts differently in cutscenes. He can breathe underwater, which opens up a number of secret paths. His health regenerates over time, and therefore there aren't health pickups on the game maps. And he's not affected by the toxic fumes that some of the Chimera enemies or weapons will emit. In those new secret pathways are a new set of intel pickups, the same sort of collectible you find in a ton of shooters that you usually never read. It's okay, this is a safe space, you can admit you don't read them either. By finding all of the infected intel, you'll unlock a plasma grenade, and from the jump in infected mode, you'll have Resistance 2's Magnum pistol in your inventory. It's all a cool bonus, as good a reason as any to go back and play the campaign again just to see what they tweaked, and the fact that these two companion games both hit in some way on the Chimera virus and the infection's impact on how people respond, that's just neat. It shows a bit of what could have been had this series' success not been halved with each new game. But that's only one fork of the two-pronged crossover. Also in Resistance 2's options menu when you've got the PSP connected is a thing called PSP Plus. It's not what you think, it's just an unfortunate name now. I mentioned earlier that the PSP Go added Bluetooth support so that you could connect it to a DualShock. Well, PSP Plus does that with any PSP model, by way of, I'm just gonna say, magic? It's only used in this particular game, but with your handheld plugged into your PS3, you would be able to play a modified version of Resistance Retribution on your PSP with full dual analog controls. This removed the strong but necessary aim assist, enabled vibration for your controller, and upped the game's difficulty by increasing the enemy spawns in many encounters in addition to improving the Chimera's aim and making them generally more ruthless. If you had any PSP model besides the original one or the budget PSP Street model that came out in Europe, it was also recommended, though not required, that you connect the PSP's video out to a TV so that you could play the game on a bigger screen and get a console-light feeling experience out of this updated mode. Alternatively, if you want to try both Infected mode and the PSP Plus experience, you can play Retribution today via the emulated PS4 and PS5 Classic re-release that's on the PlayStation Store. That wasn't in the port at launch, it got patched in after fans pointed it out. And whether it was Bend or some external team, they even added some new trophies for Infected mode to make up for the fact that they either forgot or didn't know it was there. Seeing them go back and update that release with Infected mode is what keyed me into its existence at all, or reminded me of it. I may have known at one point and forgot. And it's what kickstarted the lengthy process of digging through every other documented example of PSP to console compatibility. For my money, Resistance has the second most inspired PSP Cross-Talk feature behind SOCOM having gone all out to connect their two series. It wasn't just locking a special item behind buying the same game twice, it was A, two different games, and B, it actually impacted the game's design philosophy to some extent. I just think that's neat, and while I'm glad Sony never put in some inane initiative that any console game with a corresponding PSP port or spin-off must find a way to connect over with it, I do think it's a shame and a missed opportunity that so few of even the first-party endeavors ever even tried to play with it. Unlike most of the other early console-to-portable crossover attempts, there wasn't any extra peripheral or device needed once you had the two systems, and it was there right out of the gate for people to enjoy. Instead of being warmly remembered as this iconic, pioneering feature, it's more like, hey, here's all this neat stuff they beta tested a decade before it was ready, and we were ready for it. Which, I guess, in a way, is a lot of the PSP's legacy. That, and being the actual only device that ever used UMDs. Bet you didn't know, by the way, that there are a few PSP games that actually required multiple UMDs. I've got a whole video briefly covering the neat history of multi-disc video games if you want to check that out next. We get to exploit a disc swapping oversight and replace that iconic Final Fantasy VII cutscene with a giant laser. It's really dumb. Thanks so much for watching and for subscribing. Or for not subscribing. If you still haven't done it by the end of this video, I didn't want you here anyway. That's not true, please come back. Until next time, stay golden.